take-home points from the whole book is like take seriously the impact of religion, the positive and the negative impact of religion on immigration. Take seriously the impact of religious scriptures. Get to know the scriptures. Encourage religious people to get to know their own scriptures, because just because you are a Christian, just because you're Jewish, doesn't mean that you necessarily know everything that your own scriptures say about this topic.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen.
Hey, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen, and I'm really delighted with. We have two guests today, which doesn't happen a lot on Walk, Talk, Listen. But I'm really happy to have David and Barney here, who will introduce themselves. David, maybe you can go ahead and start.
Sure, David Elcott, and I have this lengthy career. Some people, my wife stayed in her position for 37 years. I was happy if I stayed in my positions for 10. So I moved to, in a variety of areas that increasingly interested me. I'm originally from semi-rural California, which was a rather ironic place to be. I'm a child of refugees. My mom fled Germany when she was 17 years old. She actually fled from Germany into Holland, where she had an aunt and uncle, and then from there to England and the United States. A rather traumatic move for both my parents, because they went from relative wealth to poverty, losing everything that they had, including much of their family. So my childhood, on one hand, was filled with these memories of expulsion, of being unwanted in the country in which you lived. And some tension in coming to the United States as well, because where I grew up, it was a very white Christian, people coming from the Midwest and the Ozarks. And here I was very different. I was Jewish. I was dark. My interests were not, I didn't throw a spiral football. So the real issues about race and gender and religious identity loomed large for me as a kid. I need to add one other interesting, I think very important for me, feature of my life. Much of my family was killed in World War II, but my family in Denmark and Germany and Holland and Belgium and France, those who survived were all protected by Christians who put their lives in jeopardy to save them. And I think that created this remarkable tension between what happened to my family in terms of the concentration camps and death camps, and yet at the same time, I'm here because my mother was hidden and was protected, as were other members of my family who survived. But because of my own discomfort in the world in which that I didn't belong, it made me, because I know you have two responses. One is kind of isolate yourself. The other is you better know what's going on. How do people change? What is it that is happening in the social dynamics? And that brought me to a real interest in kind of social psychology, in cultural anthropology, and in particular, how people change. So how somebody born in one country, in one world, moves to another. How do they adapt? What do they take with them? What do they let go? And in that, the idea that you're moving, that you're in another world, became very, very important to me. And that brought me to look at the religious communities, in particular their intersection with politics, and then with Barney, to think about immigration, both sides of it, people leaving and what does it mean to leave, And then what does it mean to come into a new country, a new culture? And then what does it mean for the people who have to welcome or not welcome those people coming in? And that became increasingly significant because the world these last years has been much more complicated about immigration and emigration. And now, fortunately, as an academic, unfortunately for many people, this issue of immigration looms so incredibly large.
And we will definitely talk about the book that you wrote with Barney. Your book explores how religion shapes immigration debates, sometimes dividing us, but also offering untapped potential to humanize policy and build more just responses. But before we go there, I would like the audience, my listeners, to get acquainted with Barney. Please introduce yourself, Barney.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I'm not as I'm younger than David, so my story is not going to be quite as long, and I have less sort of trauma and flight from danger in my history as well. I was raised in England to some loving parents who emphasized the importance of honesty and reliability and care for others, and I was raised a non-denominational Christian. But when I was about 20, a lot of my friends who I'd grown up with abandoned their faith and just became atheists or agnostics. And that set me on a sort of trajectory of questioning, of asking whether I could still hold to that faith myself, whether it needed to be adjusted or supplemented. And so, although initially at the time I was studying computer science at university, and I went on to become a software engineer for the BBC. I worked on the BBC website for a number of years. Those questions about religion, about the meaning of life, philosophical and theological questions didn't go away, and they just got larger and larger until eventually I felt led to quit my job at the BBC and abandon a lucrative career in software engineering and do the slightly ridiculous and crazy thing of going back to study theology and enter academia for a much less stable and lucrative career. But I've never regretted it because I love the fact that every day I get to ask and discuss really meaningful questions about the purpose of life, about what we're here for, about how we should act in this earth and how we should treat other people. I love doing that, and I love teaching my students and trying to guide them into what seem to me truth-filled and meaningful ways of thinking.
No, and yeah, thanks for sharing that. I um I would like us to, I mean, you to think a little bit about your upbringing, what you experienced and how you grew up, but then relate it to the book that you have written together. And my question is, when two people write a book together, there is usually a shared concern and also different instincts. So, what did each of you bring into this collaboration? And maybe really think about, yeah, what was it, that luggage, that, my backpack that I had as a result of my upbringing?
Barney, since you initiated this, why don't you begin?
Right. Well, I guess I'd always been raised with an understanding that part of the way one expresses one's faith is to care for those who are disadvantaged, who are not as privileged as oneself. And that can be a number of different categories. It could be disabled people or homeless people or um, any number of things. But I was going to a church in London, which at the time had launched a refugee charity, a charity that works works with refugees and tries to support them in integrating, especially with young refugees. And so, almost by accident, because I belonged to that church, I got thrown into the discourse and the discussion about refugees, and that just eventually became the main way that I thought about care for the disadvantaged. or the main category of people I was thinking about. And so after a PhD in philosophy of religion, which had really almost nothing to do with refugees, I then did a postdoctoral project on how Christians can respond to the global crisis of the ever increasing number of refugees and forced migrants in the world. It's something I was passionate about right from the start. And when, for me, being passionate about something means wanting to figure out the truth about it, understand the truth about it, and then share that with other people. And so that obviously means writing a book. But I loved the project that Routledge was doing, which was called Religion Matters, a series of books that show the impact of religion on different aspects of the SDGs. And what I loved about it was that you weren't allowed to write a book just by yourself. You had to bring in a team, and the team had to comprise people practicing members of other religions. So you had to work together. It had to be an interreligious dialogue on that particular question, which is challenging. It's always challenging to work alongside people who naturally see the world quite differently from yourself. But it's also rewarding because you learn a lot more in that process. And it changes you in ways that can be very beneficial. It makes it a better and a stronger book in the end. So I had met David Elcott at one of the book launches of his previous book. And at the time, we'd had a vigorous discussion about immigration. I remembered that discussion when I was invited to write a book for this particular project. And that's how we came to be writing the book together.
Barney and I come from different worlds in many ways. I'm a political scientist and also trained in Jewish text and theology, which is unusual. Most political scientists don't want to really deal with religion other than Catholics do this and Protestants do that. And on the whole, theologians like to stick with theology. We don't want to get mucked up with real world history, real events. You want to in the realm of text and so for us, finding a way to dialogue was not easy. And I think that the book really reflects in many ways the depth of our conversations and our engagements. We're also generationally really removed. I'm more than twice Barney's age. Life experience radically different as well. For me, so a major difference, one other thing, I've been involved in interfaith work forever. My doctoral work, much of my work was dealing with Islam in the Middle East, and I am trained in medieval Muslim theology. And then in my professional life, I was the interfaith director of the American Jewish Committee, meeting in the Vatican, meeting with Muslim leaders. I was involved with Muslims and Christians in Palestine and Jews in Israel, trying to bring them together in dialogue. So I've been deeply immersed in the political world. But on a more basic level, Judaism doesn't have theology in the way that Christianity does. Jews are much more carnal. So our theology deals with the food we eat, with our bodies, with sex, with life. That's theology and history. There is no way to speak about Jewish unless you're going to deal with the historical experience of Jews, particularly Jews in exile, Jews in diaspora, Jews as refugees. That's a really different experience than Barney's experience. And finding a conversation and a way to dialogue in that was, I think, in many ways, for me personally, more profound than writing another book. It was really a wonderful experience. We did want to have Islam as part of it and worked so hard to find someone who would join with us. And in the end, it didn't pan out. So it only has the two religions by default, not by desire. And then the other part was, where do we deal with in the world? Where do we look? There are so many places where refugees are a critical issue. We have, are a critical issue. But we felt most comfortable dealing with the United States, with Europe, and with Israel. Israel and America being two opportunities to look at very different Jewish communities. And of course, the various European countries and the United States, all of them dealing in different ways with immigration. So kind of that brought us together. And then the third piece that Barney was very important in Barney's arranging for the book was, this is not meant to be just theoretical. The goal was to make sure that people engage, whether it's policymakers, politicians, lay people who are involved in immigration issues, that they would be able to use the book, that it would be functional for them, that it would help them better understand, in particular, the ways that religion is a critical piece of determining policy today when it comes to immigration. And then just on the personal level, we when the Vietnamese fled, the boat people fled, I was involved then living in California with the Jewish community taking in many Vietnamese families. And later on here, living in New York, we did the same, not only creating social services, food pantries, and housing, but actually bringing in immigrants from Afghanistan, immigrants from Syria into the Jewish community. When you think about that dynamic, that the Jewish community welcomed and provided housing and schools and support for refugees. So on the very life level, similar to Barney, I was engaged in working with immigrants and helping them. So that gives you a little bit of our bias on the issue, although the book really tries its hardest to make the argument, the various arguments that can be made from religious perspectives, text, Bible, and later commentary, try to show the different ways that religion is being used and even can be used to address issues of immigration.
No, thanks for that, David. And I would like us to go into, the contents and the core messages of the book. But I have one more question about your collaboration. What surprised you about each other during the writing process? Barney, you first.
I think it's not just a matter of coming at this topic from different religious perspectives. We're also just very different people. Like, there could be somebody with David's personality who was a Christian. There could be somebody with my personality who was a Jew. But our writing style is very different. I like to be very structured and sort of logical, step by step, very measured, but often a little dull. I think my first chapter on Christianity, even people who really liked it said it was not exactly riveting. And with David's help, I was able to add a little bit of flair to it and make it a bit more exciting and interesting read. And so David and I think, helped each other to strengthen the book, both by structuring it well, but also by making it an impassioned thing. Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
No, you go.
I think the major, I alluded to that, a major area of author tension was, to what degree is it do we only look at what people believe, or what the religious leaders say, or do we look at what happens on the ground? So, for example, let's take a present example. The Pope speaks about immigration in the name of the church, and it's reflected not only in homilies, but in, I would think, in churches in various places in the United States. On the other hand, the majority of Catholics voted for Donald Trump and Donald Trump's immigration policy. How do you, as an author, bring that together, right? How do you address what's happening on the ground, what Catholics or Protestants or Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists do, and what they say and what Scripture says? And I think that there we add a different approach as a political scientist. I want to see what people are doing. Also, as I said, in Jewish we have a text, a Talmudic text that says Moses is very upset and says the people aren't obeying you, God, and they don't believe in you. And our text says, God says, I don't care whether they believe in me or not. I just want to see what they're doing. Right? That is very different from the way other religions may approach even theology. So it took time for us to find a way to address these issues. For me, if Barney, in looking at Christianity and immigration, doesn't deal with the expulsion of Jews and Muslims over 1,000 years, if it doesn't deal with that, is it honestly dealing with Christianity? Right? So that was an area of a push, in an area that most theologians wouldn't have it there as part of their conversation.
So, was there maybe an argument, tension, or unresolved question that actually improved the book?
Well, I think David challenged me on this because what I'd written was a largely theoretical piece about how Christians ought to treat and deal with immigrants. And David challenged me to spend more time looking at in history, not just what the Bible says and what Christians, what popes have said or whatever, but also what Christian politicians have done and how they've actually acted with regard to immigrants throughout history, especially these expulsions of Jews in the 16th and 17th centuries. But I think my own pushback on that was, look, I'm not going to end up writing in a Jewish style, since I'm still a Christian and I want to write it from a Christian point of view. And one of the things that Christianity does is it holds up an ideal, a way that people should live, even if nobody has ever lived that way. Apart from Jesus, that's what Christians would say, right? Jesus is the only one who ever actually lived the way we're supposed to live. And it holds up that ideal, and it holds everybody to that standard. And that ideal has to be theoretical if nobody's ever lived up to it. It has to be some sort of abstract, almost unreachable standard of living. But then I think I accepted David's point very much, that it's not good enough just to hold up that ideal. You have to actually look at how it was practiced and how it was lived out throughout different elements of history. So I did change my chapter quite a lot. We argued for about 3 hours once about my chapter, and the consequence of that was my chapter got a lot bigger and it got a lot more historical. But I still held on to what I think were some of the distinctively Christian elements of it.
Yeah, and I'm much more interested in the dialectic, the theological dialectic. So certainly within the Jewish world, if we actually are going to talk text and theology, you have one voice that says, you shall care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in your midst, because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And that ends up being the most oft-cited law commandment in the Bible. It's 36 times it is mentioned in the Pentateuch, in the Torah. At the same time, we have texts that said, we just read on Passover, wipe out the enemy, wipe them out, because they will seduce you with their alien theologies. And so you have a second stream emanating from the Bible, from the original source. You have a second stream that says that the other will pollute you and will pollute your faith and take you away from God, and therefore you have the right to destroy them. So here you have these two variant traditions, and it is clear to me that plays itself out for thousands of years for Jews. It plays itself out for Christians. It plays itself out for Muslims as well. And luckily, because we're equal opportunity doing cruel things to people, even Buddhists in Myanmar and in, did terrible things in forcing Muslims out of their country. So for me, that's a very critical point, but it is theological. It's not only political, because people will cite text, they'll cite the tradition in justifying even some of the most abhorrent behavior I think we're seeing that today, aren't we, in the world in which we are in at this very moment.
So what is the central invitation of the book? So, and not only intellectually, but also personally.
Well, we have a set of sort of action points that we have in very brief
Mhm.
summary at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. And I think bear in mind that this book was written not only or even primarily for existing members of these religions, but for people who don't belong to those religions or maybe don't even belong to any religion, to try and help them understand the role that religion plays in in their work with regard to immigration. So one of the main sort of take home points from the whole book is like take seriously the impact of religion, the positive and the negative impact of religion on immigration, take seriously the impact of religious scriptures, get to know the scriptures, encourage religious people to get to know their own scriptures, because just because you are a Christian, just because you're Jewish, doesn't mean that you necessarily know everything that your own scriptures say about this topic. Go deep, dive into it, and understand the ambiguous role that religion can play, because religion can play a role both as beliefs and practices, as a call to live a certain way, but it can also play a role as an exclusionary practice. Like if my religious identity is bound up with my national identity, then I won't want people from another religion coming into my country. So understand the driving force of religion in both of these different ways, both to exclude and to welcome.
I would say that religion in this case, exactly following religion is a fuel. It's not an end in itself, but it is a fuel that ignites some of the huge violence that we've seen historically and presently, and the violent rhetoric that's being used at this very moment to explain and justify. I think my experience. So I toured the country. I had a wonderful grant from the Ford Foundation to go into churches and across the country. And one of my experiences was in Vidalia, Georgia, which is a very, what they call redneck, very conservative, a church that was what they call Covenant of God. They speak in tongues. And and at a certain point, after I did interviews, they wanted to know about me and they asked me to preach. Well, they asked me to preach partially because I said to them, I read the Bible in the original. That got them very excited. And in the story that I used from the Bible, when it was over, the first response was, maybe it is a hubris on our parts. It's audacity for us to think we're the only ones that understand Scripture. We're the only ones of faith. There is nobody else. Maybe we need to be a little more humble and realize there are other ways that people of faith, honest people of faith, can see the world. And I think that's the point Barney's making here. The goal of the book was not simply to state what Christians do or do not believe, or Jews do or do not believe, but to say, hey, look at this. There are different ways, even within Christianity, even within Judaism. There are different ways of seeing the world. And that alone, independent of kind of the words that we wrote, that alone opens you up to say, I don't have the only truth in the world. That in fact, something I believe deeply, that to claim that you have the absolute truth, that you have the absolute understanding of God, is actually the form of idolatry that the Bible proscribes. And I think that was really, in the end, at the core of our writing, was to and the fact that it was a Jew and a Christian writing together, in the very act of writing, creates a model of there's not only one way of seeing the world, and that people of faith need to have the humility to understand that somebody else may have a piece of the puzzle that we don't have, and that they have a piece of the puzzle. We both, we have something to give, we have something to take.
No, thanks, David. Can I maybe for piggyback on immigration, because that's the book that you wrote together, and what if we look at the world today, world that's very polarized. When we talk about immigration, we talk about numbers, borders, systems, right? Um, but your work, I think your book, if I understood it correctly, it suggests that it is also about identity, dignity, belonging, um, and that religion sits right in the middle of that. So, can we explore that maybe a bit more? Or am I wrong in my assumptions that that's what you were trying to do?
You go, David.
Yeah. So um, we talk about belief, belonging, and behavior, right? And that when you look at religious life and religious expression, you want to look at all of those. So that's exactly to your point, that we wanted people to explore what they believe. What is it that motivates them as a person of faith? What do they do? What's their behavior? But I think that for me in particular, and I think Barney and I, this is not, we don't stand exactly in the same place for the very reasons that Barney explained, that for me, the core is the issue of identity. Why? Because I'm convinced that the religious identity, as I said, is the fuel that's motivating, in particular, populist nationalism. And therefore, the question of who's in and who's out, who is the other, does the other need to be curtailed, proscribed, eradicated? That has become remarkably pungent in the 21st century. I think that after World War II, there was this sense of, after the horrors of World War II, was we all could hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And it doesn't matter your color, your gender, your race, your religion. We're all human beings. And we are all, and for about 40, 50 years, yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it did all right. And then we started seeing these eruptions all over the world. It wasn't just in Africa between Muslims and Christians and animists. All over, people were beginning to say, "No, this is who I am, and you don't belong." And I think that is a radical shift in which religious identity, probably more than ethnicity, race, gender, sexual identity. I think that religious identity is probably the most significant motivator now for the ways people are responding in their own countries to who belongs, who's in, who's out, who is the other, and what to do with them. And I think our book very much, I mean, my writing, that's what I've been writing about now for many years. I saw this already, more than a decade ago. And I think that that's very much where Barney and I saw ourselves. It's almost surprising, because there was so much about religion that was, we all believe in God in different ways and we can all get along. And this is so shocking that this would actually be such a source for violence and really a source for destruction.
Barney?
Yeah, I guess one of the key takeaways for me from writing the book is precisely that religion can be understood by even the religious in different ways. If you ask somebody who's religious, what does it mean to you that you're religious? They might say different things. The word isn't what you might say univocal. It doesn't have one single universally agreed meaning. I grew up non-denominational evangelical Christian, and for that community, it was all about what you believe. It was just I'm a Christian because I believe these things about Jesus, these things about God, these things about the Bible, and that's what makes me a Christian. But I'll never forget starting to encounter people who saw it differently and who would say things like, well, you must be an Anglican because you're English. I'm a Catholic because I'm from Spain. And for them, it wasn't anything to do with belief. It was to do with where you were from. And that was how they understood their religious identity, was in a completely different way. And I found since that even within Christianity, there's a great deal of diversity of how people understand what it means to be Christian. Are you a Christian just because you're baptized? Or are you a Christian just because you're from a Christian country? Or are you a Christian because you believe a certain set of things, even if you don't practice them? Or are you a Christian because you practice certain things, even if you don't believe them? All different kinds of combinations you can have. And that when we look at the question of immigration in particular, the way people understand their religiosity can have an impact on their final conclusions about immigration policy. I think that was one of the key insights that I took away.
I'll add one thing in the research, in my research, in my prior writing, it turned out the less you go to, for Christians, the more you go to church, the less likely you would be to support kind of Christian nationalism, this identitarian politics. The more you go to church, the less you would, in fact, the less you would be part of this Christian identity movement. That's the opposite in the Jewish world. The more likely you are to go to synagogue on a regular basis and more observant you are, the more likely you will be to have negative views towards others, people of other faith, and certainly people coming into your country. So it's an irony to me, in a sense, to maybe, Barney, if you don't mind me saying, to your point, which is that Christianity, which is I'm identifying as a Christian, not as a Spanish Christian or a Swedish Lutheran, that it is probably more likely, if that's your core and it's not connected to your national identity, you're more likely to have more positive views towards the other. And so it's really an ironic difference between Christians and Jews. And I would say in this case, Muslims, similarly with Muslims, meaning piety does not necessarily make you identify with your religion, your political identity. I think that has to do with Christianity being much more Catholic, not Catholic small c, not big C. If you see yourself as universal, if you see yourself as a universal church, then a particular national identity is not going to trump that. Whereas when Jews became increasingly engaged with Zionism and with the belief that there needs to be an independent Jewish state, in fact, as we're seeing today, it's not an area that we're necessarily going to go into, but the tension between being a Zionist, being an Israeli, and being a Jew is wreaking havoc right now, particularly for Jews outside of Israel. Who are you? What is your identity? So in the Jewish case, it is not Catholic in that way. It's not universal. It's very particularist. And the identity, the political identity and the religious identity are much more tied together than I would think in the case of Christians who see their Christian identity as more at the core than their national identity.
Thanks, David. Barney, I just saw you while you were listening to David. At a certain moment, moments you were kind of smiling. And is there something that you agree with or don't agree with, or that you would like to comment on?
No, not particularly. I mean, David and I have talked about these things quite a lot, and we came to enough agreement to write a book that we both signed up to, and that has both of our names on. Those chapters, obviously, I'm more responsible for the chapters on Christianity, and David's more responsible for the chapters on Judaism. But we both own all of those chapters because it's a book that's co-authored by us. And I think all I would say is that no, I don't think I have anything to add, actually, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. I would like to make a jump to the younger generation. It's a topic that I often start talking about when I'm walking, and when I think about purpose and why am I walking and younger generation. So my question is, are younger generations rejecting religion or rejecting forms of religion that are no longer or don't longer feel credible?
Come on, you want to complicate that question. Are younger people are all over the place.
Uh-huh.
In the case of Israel, the older you are, the more likely you are to be liberal, to be open to the world. The younger you are, the more likely you are to be extremist, right wing, willing to do, as we're seeing in Israel, do terrible things, supposedly in the name of God. So, at the same time, statistically, we know that the largest growth religion in America is none, right? So you can't speak about one or the other when you look at turning points, or you look at the other movements that are bringing in young Christians, in particular, and linking them to right-wing politics. You'd say, well, that's the future of religion. On the other hand, the majority of young people in Europe and in America, the majority of them may be moving in the opposite direction. Look at a great example for the Jewish community is what happened in New York. You have a socialist, very strong anti-Zionist running for mayor. The older Jews voted, in this case, voted against him. But younger Jews, when you look at, let's say, Brooklyn Park Slope, they voted for him, meaning his anti-Zionism didn't get in the way of their Jewishness and their politics. So I'd love to just, and Barney, go ahead, but I'd love to mess up these questions. There is no this direction or that direction. I think what we can say is that the structures of authority that religion represented 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, that and the behaviors that went with that are weakening all over. That doesn't mean that there aren't other behaviors and other structures that are being created. But certainly the ways that religion played a role in society 100 years ago is radically, radically different today. The idea that the vice president of the United States, who's a Catholic, can basically say to the Pope, well, you don't belong in this conversation. Chances are 100 years ago, he wouldn't have, as a Catholic, he wouldn't have said that about the Pope. So we're in a real different age. And I think it's the multiplicity and diversity of it that is its hallmark, its signpost. And again, I'll go back. I think what our book is attempting to do is to reflect that and reflect that diversity and give people a space within the book to find themselves, but also to explore alternatives.
No, and I think, you were able to accomplish that. So,
anyway, Barney, I don't know how your read is on this.
The young people question.
Mhm.
So I've seen a number of graphs now which look at the amount of church attendance and self-identification as Christian in the West, in European countries and in American countries. And that graph has always, for decades, it's been on slow decline, right? Just going down and down and down and down. But several of the graphs produced in the last couple of years show a little uptick at the very end of that, especially among men more than women, where the graphs show a distinction between men and women, that there's been more women who were Christians through most of the 20th century and the 21st. But in the last 2 years, there seems to have been sudden resurgence among young men of interest in religion, of interest in church attendance and Christianity. Those statistics are still controversial. There are still some people who believe that what they call the quiet revival is not actually happening. And some of the statistics have actually been exposed as based on faulty data. Those were the wilder statistics who talked about a massive resurgence. But there seems to be something that's happening. And some slight pushback among the very young, people in their early 20s, pushback against the sort of secular, non-religious narrative. They're no longer quite so satisfied with those answers, and they're looking for a kind of transcendent meaning somewhere. And they're willing to entertain the idea that that might be found in church. Who knows where it's going to lead? It might be a little blip, and then church attendance will continue to decline after that. Who knows? But for now, there's a slight increased interest in faith and in Christianity and in religion in general.
I'm going to be an old curmudgeon. I'm in my mid 70s, and I'm looking at the linkage for many, not just in the Christian world, but in the Muslim world, in the Jewish world, in the Hindu world, and the Buddhist world as well. It's linkage of hypermasculinity in religion. I'll never forget in The Passion of the Christ, in the movie that Mel Gibson, the resurrection. I don't know if you saw it or remember, but the resurrection was of this Jesus that kind of looked like Donald Trump, in his self-description of a kind of a triumphant Jesus leaving the grave, like the battle hymn of the Republic, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So the concern I have is if this religious revival that we're seeing is actually linked to a kind of hyper-masculine identity that is actually not what I would want to see in religion. Certainly the Jewish community, what's happening on the West Bank, for example, is all by young men. These are not the older Zionist settlers who believe that Israel should control all of the land. They're appalled by what the young guys are doing, going in and beating up people and burning down olive trees and murdering people. They're appalled by that. And so I would say that and here I'll need to research this more, and we'll need to see how this moves. But it's not necessarily making me happy. It's wonderful to see Barney, who's a young Christian theologian who leaves.
I'm not in my early 20s anymore.
Okay, but for me, believe me, Barney, you're young. And he leaves his high-tech job and all of that to immerse himself in a religion that is truly godly, right? And that's wonderful. And if that were the example of young men who are becoming more religious, I'd be thrilled. I'm not so sure that's where it's going.
So David, I mean, that's where you still see hope in people like Barney. But Barney, where do you still see hope?
I think what I would say is these people may be turning to faith for reasons that are not always the sort of pure search for the good and for the true. There may be mixed and ambiguous reasons for a interest in religion. But I can only hope that insofar as these people are turning to faith, that they will actually engage with the resources that faith offers, and that it might actually provide a corrective. I don't think any of us comes, into anything with perfect and pure motives. The motives are themselves part of what needs to be purified, part of what needs to be adjusted and maybe rebuked and corrected sometimes. And I think I would just like to say that I believe that Christianity has the resources to address that kind of thing. It has the resources to address toxic masculinity by holding up the figure of Jesus as he really is depicted in the Gospels. And it has the resources to address a radical sort of exclusivism by showing the way that Jesus welcomed people without necessarily affirming all of their behavior and all of their practices, but he befriended them first and foremost. And if anybody is serious enough about their turn to faith to engage with the scriptures and with the religious institutions that preserve those scriptures, they're going to find themselves transformed in ways they might not have expected at the beginning.
Amen.
I really like the fact that the two of you have written this book together. Collaborated on this. It's a pity that maybe you were not able to find somebody from Islam with that particular background. Nevertheless, I think it's an important book that people should read. And what I really hope to contribute with this particular podcast is that I connect people. We are connected. I connect you with the listeners. And connection is the first step into ultimately dialogue. And I know, David, you've written a lot about dialogue, that it is not as simple as people might think. Still, I would like to connect you with the previous guest. And the previous guest has a question for you both.
So I think for the next guest, I went back and forth. So you can choose. I had two questions that are very different, but I don't know what how you may feel. So I'll let you choose out of the two. I would either say, from like a values-based question, it would be, in moments where they're dealing with kind of conflict management, what trait or value do they struggle with in that moment that they're trying to improve? So I would like more values-based. Or if we're looking more forward-looking for 2026, I would say this is just a fun one. In 5 words, describe what 2026 looks like for you, or you aim for it to look like, hope to achieve, maybe.
Yeah, go Barney. You go.
If I'm trying to manage conflict between two people, I think the thing I am tempted to do is to be timid and shy and not actually come out with my own opinions, or not actually push people, but just to sort of brush it under the carpet and say the important thing is that we all get along. Let's not raise this. And I think that, to correct myself on that, I believe that there are some times when you can only make progress by addressing the real source of the disagreement, the real cause of conflict, rather than trying to sweep it away or brush it away or sort of pretend that it doesn't really matter. You have to admit that it does really matter and focus on it, and that's the only way you can make progress.
So the abiding principle for me in engaging others is a rabbinic principle, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, that these opposing viewpoints are both the word of God. The Jewish understanding of, for example, when there's disagreement, the court is in disagreement, they will maintain the minority position and make sure that everyone knows it. And they argue that who knows that it's sometime in the future, the minority position will become the majority, a necessary majority position. So my belief deeply is in that notion that the oneness of God isn't singularity, but the oneness of God is actually the capacity to have all different views can all be contained in the oneness of God. That said, when I'm confronting somebody who has radically different views that for me feel dangerous and scary, if I'm a researcher, I can handle it. I take my notes, I listen. But if it's about my life and of my family, of my children, of my grandchildren, of my world, it is very hard for me to hold on to that principle that I so believe in. But I'm looking at that other person going, okay, I believe, except what you're saying. How can you say that? So I think that for me is a really difficult thing. I have no problem with let's deal with it. Let's look at it. But then what do I do if somebody is saying something that's so anathema to everything I believe in, to my understanding of God's presence in the world? What do I do then? So I would teach. So a lot of my work, we didn't talk about, I was a professor for many years at New York University. Now I'm at Columbia, the Center for Justice, but my teaching is not at Columbia. My teaching is in a maximum security prison. And I teach men who are incarcerated, many of them for many, many decades. And we have Muslims and we have Christians. We have people who don't believe anything. And so for much of my work, particularly before I did this, was teaching advocacy and organizing, how to go out and change the world. So on one hand, I'm saying to them, you got to go out and change these people, you got to defeat them. They need to lose in the next election, at the same time, I want to be teaching, you have to be open, you have to listen, you have to engage, you have to be in conversation. I think it's very hard. And I think, again, the extreme polarization that I think Barney and I were attempting to address by giving a forum for conversation, but this extreme polarization is very, very difficult. By the way, I want to add one thing. I'm not sure if you know this. Barney worked hard to make sure that this book is an open source book. As much as we would like to,
Open access.
Yeah, as much as we would like to make a lot of money and go on a vacation to the Bahamas with our royalties, the money we earn, the reality is you can get this book and not pay anything. And I think that this was really Barney's push, that it would be used by more people and that it would be available, and not something where buying it would get in the way. You don't have to wait a moment to read it. You can click and there it is.
Okay. We will make sure that I add a link in the podcast notes. So thanks for mentioning that. The second question of the previous guest was in 5 words, and we are already in April, but still I'm going to ask it. What do you hope 2026 will look like in 5 words?
Finish writing my next book.
Can I do 6?
I'm fine with it.
that joy is an act of resistance. It's a quote, not mine, but it's a quote. The joy is an act of resistance. We need more joy in the world and hope.
Okay, thank you. I'm cognizant of the time. I still have a few questions that I would like to ask. If we can keep the answers, in a tweet, a couple of maybe maximum 2 sentences, that would be great. The first question that I have for you is the most difficult question. We talked about this before we started recording. So music is very important to me, so I always ask a question about music. If I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies for a big part what you are about, which song or piece of music would that be and why?
There will be a hymn written by John Bell in the early 20th century called The Summons. If I have time to explain a little bit why, it's a hymn about being called by name to live a particular life, to engage with God. And I think what I love about that hymn is that it shows how to be religious means to have felt deep in your inner being, to have been called by name by your Creator, and to respond to that call with your whole life, with all of your thoughts, your dreams, your possessions, every minute of your time. Everything you are and do is now a response to being called by name.
Thanks. And I will make sure to add that.
I know this is going to sound strange, but Mahler's Resurrection, which is ironic. Mahler was a Jew who becomes a Catholic, and he writes this Resurrection in which the words are, I believe, I believe, I believe. Freud would say maybe that was too many I believes, but the music, the first time I heard it in symphony, had they had a baptismal font in the front of the hall, I probably would have dived in. There's something so unbelievably powerful and faith-filled. It was just, for me, a remarkable experience.
And just for the listeners to remind them, those two songs will be added to the Spotify playlist that we made. If you go to Spotify and you go to #WalkTalkListen, you find all the songs that have been selected by my guests. And that is from hard rock to hymns to reggae to rock and roll. If I ask you to come up with a message, a question, or an invitation for the listeners, what would it be?
I'll go back to what I said. Joy is an act of resistance.
Okay.
That, we need to find joy because joy is the pathway to hope.
Make friends with somebody who sees the world very differently than the way you do. It will expand your horizons way more than watching any other TV show or reading any other book.
Cool. Before I thank you for today's conversations, which has been far too short. That's the difficulty when you talk with two people, the challenge that we had. I really invite the listeners to check out your book. We have heard now that it is open access. I would really encourage you to pay for it. There was a lot of hard work that went into this. So is there any question, Barney and David, that I should have asked you today, but I did not?
Yeah, and I'm happy not to answer it, which is, what are your own views about immigration? I think that we tried really hard in our book to be open to different ways. That was the only way we could feel justified in writing. And we were as careful as we could be to not overwhelm with our own views of what immigration should be. And you didn't ask us. And now we're not going to tell you because it's the end of the podcast.
Although that is what my next book is going to be about.
So, the reason, just for the listeners, that I did not ask you that question, you said to me, don't ask me about immigration. Ask me about what immigration reveals about society. And I do think we talked about that. Yeah. But, Barney, anything from your side?
No.
Okay. Then I would like to thank you for today's conversation, for everything you do, for who you are. All the best with the next books. And I would really encourage people not only to read, the book that you wrote jointly, but David, you have written really, some excellent stuff that folks should read. And the same is for Barney. All the best with everything you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your jumping into this. It's wonderful.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.